Miss Nobody. Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 2. As the week sped towards spring, Angela became stronger. Her ankle was perfectly sound again. Her bruises and lacerations had healed without a scar, but her brain remained clouded. Clive assured her that sooner or later some incident would cause the veil between her and her past to lift, but he also admitted he didn't know much about mental illness. "But I'm perfectly sane," she pointed out. "Good heavens, girl, I didn't mean you're a nutcase, but I don't understand this blackout. However, when we reach civilization again, a specialist will soon put you right." Angela began to view this return with increasing apprehension, fearing what she might discover. One day, tentatively handling Clive's portable typewriter, she found she could type. Her fingers remembered a skill that her conscious mind had obliterated. That solved the problem of filling her empty hours. Clive gave her his pages of notes to decipher, and not only was she glad of the occupation, but she was pleased to feel that she was helping him. Since she needed no further medical attention, he ceased to come into her room. Instead, they spent the evenings in the apology for a sitting room, which he made more habitable by bringing in cushions and rugs from his bedroom and installed the typewriter. Then they would discuss the proposed book, for which her work was the preliminary, and the country and its ways, drinking the coffee he brewed on the stove. This came from his private store. The Nuristani, like the rest of the Afghans, drank tea. Clothes had been a problem. The shirt and trousers which she had been wearing when found had disintegrated. Aziza produced voluminous skirts, tunics and shawls in which Angela was buried. She was not much of a dressmaker, but she managed to cut them down into something wearable. When she went outside, she had the boots and sheepskin coat Clive had procured for her. She had a suspicion that he had paid Aziza in some way for the articles, and thus increased her debt to him. When she tentatively raised the subject, he told her to regard them as payment for her services. During their evening sessions, he gave her a great deal of information about the country in which she was living, though she would have far rather talked about himself. Realizing his deep interest in it and other remote places, she sought to share his enthusiasm. Afghanistan, like many of its neighbours, was changing fast, modernising and developing, with new roads, new schools and buildings, the abolition of the veil, and the emergence of women into public life. Politically, Russian influence was in the ascendant, the Soviet Empire impinging upon the steppes which lay on the further side of the mountains, and only the river Oxus, or Amu Darya, to give it its modern name, dividing the two countries. But it was the country's history that appealed to Clive, and in which he sought to arouse her interest. Alexander had colonised it, but all the cities he had built had vanished, though Kandahar still bore his name, being a corruption of Iskandar, as he was known in Persian. Genghis Khan had overrun it, bringing slaughter and destruction, and a century later, Tamerlane. The Hazaras, the people of the Central Plateau, were descendants of the slit-eyed Mongols, and occupied an inferior position to the Pashtuns or Pathans, who were the ruling caste. The races were very mixed, and all colourings were to be found there, from blonde to brunette, brown, blue, and grey eyes. Kipling had immortalised the Pathans, the proud, arrogant, darkly handsome men who ruled in Kabul. The British had fought 3 Afghan wars and finally given up trying to subdue the country, confining themselves to guarding the Khyber Pass that connected it with India. Famous, or rather infamous in history, was the terrible massacre of a British army in retreat from Kabul, the garrison travelling through the snows of winter with its women and children. Every one of them had been wiped out except one man, Dr. Brydon, who had ridden into Jalalabad bearing the dreadful news and there died himself of his wounds. Clive was also deeply interested in the origins and habits of the nomad population who wandered through the land from the Central Plateau, which they occupied in summer, down to the Indian plains in winter, driving their herds of sheep and goats and loading their gear onto shaggy Bactrian camels. They lived their secret independent lives, beholden to no one, and their black pointed tents, guarded by huge savage dogs, were a feature of many a landscape. Like Desdemona, Angela listened and became enthralled while Clive talked, and not only of Afghanistan, but of the other places he had been in, Greenland, the Sahara, and the forests of Amazonia. And like Desdemona, she became more and more fascinated by the hero of these adventures. He was her only companion, for she did not progress with her Nuristani and her communications with Aziza never amounted to conversation. As for the rest of the villagers, the women always seemed to be indoors when she went out, though they worked in the fields in spring and summer. The men held aloof, quickly averting their eyes if she appeared. Even the children seemed to hold her in awe, for they usually ran away if she approached them. This hurt her because she was fond of little ones. When she complained to Clive, he laughed and told her, "It's because they've been told you're not entirely human, and they're afraid you might put a spell upon them. Stories about genies and fairies are common in their folklore, in spite of their conversion to Islam." "But couldn't you make them understand I'm just ordinary?" "You couldn't be to them, my dear. Not only was your arrival mysterious, but you live in my house. I'm the great medicine man who has, by the aid of my medicine chest and a little savvy, cured ills they believed incurable. I'm afraid my aura enfolds you as well." She remembered he had told her she had been dubbed his woman, and looked at him provocatively, but he merely smiled at her indulgently. He was always kind and friendly, but she doubted if he ever saw her as a woman. She was either a child or an interesting patient. In that connection, the dark curtain continued to withhold the knowledge of her identity. Clive told her repeatedly not to worry. One day it would all come back. Actually, she was not worrying at all. She was content to live in this strange white world without past or future, where her whole existence revolved around the personality of Clive Stratton. The future meant separation from him. The past, she was convinced, held sorrows she wanted to forget. That might account for her persistent blackout. She did not want to remember, nor so long as she remained in her snowbound sanctuary did it matter who she was. But it had come to an end. But it had to come to an end. The days lengthened, snow fell less frequently, and the icy gales abated. Suddenly it was spring, the snow vanishing from the valley floor and shrinking up the mountainsides. The valley sheltered fruit trees and arable fields, with a river running through them. The goats and sheep ran joyously from rock to rock, seeking the hitherto concealed herbage. Birds began to sing, and the villagers started preparations to plough and sow their fields. Clive, who had been up to investigate, reported that the pass out of the village was now passable, and it was time to start his journey south. "I'm afraid it will be too arduous a trek for you," he told Angela, looking at her critically. "Although you look quite fit now. I propose to leave you here and arrange to send a helicopter to bring you out." Angela was appalled. To be left alone with only Aziza, whom she could rely upon for an indefinite period, was more than she could endure. She pleaded desperately with Clive to be allowed to accompany him. She felt strongly enough to face any ordeal, she assured him. She had put on weight, and there was now colour in her cheeks. At length he yielded to her pleading, concluding that she was nervous of travelling by air after her experience, and he was a little doubtful if he could procure the services of a helicopter, the only machine which could land in that valley. "I suppose I must finish the job and get you safe back to civilization," he said a little ruefully, "but it'll be a long, rough journey." "Anything would be better than being left alone here," she insisted, grieved that he showed so little desire for her company. "But wouldn't you... don't you mind what becomes of me?" "I'd certainly like to know you're all right and safe with your relations, of which you must have some somewhere." "Very well, waif, I won't abandon you." And with that, she had to be content. As soon as she understood Angela was going to Kabul, Aziza created an amusing diversion. Although village women went unveiled while working in the fields, when they went to town, they considered their dignity required them to appear in a chadri. In vain, Clive told her she was old-fashioned. The chadri was no longer worn in the capital. The king's household had set an example, appearing in public without covering their faces. Aziza did not believe him. Respectable Moslem women always went veiled, and they would always do so. Some years ago, King Ad-Mullah had tried to introduce drastic reforms far too quickly, including the abolition of the veil. This last innovation had cost him his throne. Now it was gradually disappearing, and even the mullahs, the religious leaders, did not object. But Aziza could not or would not accept that it could be so. She produced one of her own chadris for Angela's use, and though the girl had no intention of accepting the garment, she could not resist trying it on. Composed of voluminous folds of material, it covered her completely from head to toe, air and vision being admitted through a sort of latticework visor over the face. It seemed to her inconceivable that women had endured its tyranny for centuries whenever they went out. She went mincing into Clive's room to show herself, though there was nothing to see of her except her feet. "At least it wouldn't matter how old or ugly one was," she remarked. "It hides everything." He laughed. Afghan men declare they always knew if a veiled woman was young and pretty. A sort of sixth sense, I suppose. Incidentally, a woman always walked one pace behind her man, less, I fancy, as a sign of inferiority than for protection. Still, she did serve her husband on bended knee and address him as presence. Now all that is going. Women have the vote and are being encouraged to go out to work. His eyes gleamed mischievously. Such a pity. I would like to possess a subservient wife and have the excuse. I would like to possess. I would like to possess a subservient wife and have the exclusive right to view her face. "For shame!" Angela rebuked him, laughing. "You're a Westerner, Clive, not an Eastern despot." "But you must admit a veil is very intriguing." He touched the long folds. "Imagine the excitement of drawing it aside to discover what's underneath." "And finding a plain Jane, which would serve you right." There was an unfamiliar glint in his eyes which made her feel a little breathless. "If you want to play the Eastern potentate, you'd look more in character if you wore a turban." "I rate a caraculi, not a turban, as I rank as a Khan, and I believe you've seen me in one." He was referring to the caracul hat, which was the common wear of city men. "It's not nearly so impressive as a turban. I suggest a pink one with a tail." Oh no, I think that's her. "It's not nearly so impressive as a turban. I suggest a pink one with a tail, such as Aziz's son swaggers around in." "Wouldn't suit my colouring. And don't you go making eyes at young Abdullah. It might give him ideas." "Not him. He always looks the other way when he sees me." Clive looked up at her teasingly from the pile of cushions upon which he was sprawled upon the floor. He was wearing a knitted sweater, which appeared a little incongruous with his boots and baggy trousers. "Doesn't want to poach upon my preserves, and that get-up of yours is giving me ideas. It rouses the dominating male in me. By rights, you should be kneeling before me." Angela felt a faint stir of excitement. She had not met this mood in him before. She said decisively, "I'm not going to pander to you, and from what you've told me, Afghan women are absorbing Western ideas about sex equality." "More's the pity," he said shortly. "You believe in keeping women subservient?" He smiled wryly. It makes life easier for the men, but it will be a long time before Western notions really get a hold. An unfaithful wife is still regarded as an outcast, and her brothers and father are quite capable of putting her to death to wipe out the shame she's brought upon the family." "How dreadful!" He shrugged his shoulders. "Afghan men can be devils when their passions are aroused, and they have their own peculiar idea of honour." "I don't suppose they're always faithful." "That's different." "The double standard?" His eyes glinted sardonically. "Dear me, waif, you've got the jargon off pat, haven't you? Perhaps you were an ardent supporter of women's rights in your forgotten past. But I hope not." "I'm all for fairness and justice," she said earnestly. "My child, you rarely get either between men and women. Emotionalism blinds them." His eyes went beyond her, and his face became bleak as a winter's day. "Women are the unfair sex in that respect," he stated. "A taste of good old Oriental discipline would do some I've known a lot of good. Sluts who enjoy playing havoc with men's tenderest feelings and expect to get away unscathed." He spoke more to himself than to her, and she thought he had forgotten her presence, lost in some painful memory. She slipped off the shrouding garment and folded it carefully. There must have been women in his life. He was too virile a man to be indifferent to sex. Even her innocence realized that. One must have played him false, and that was why he wandered over the earth seeking for forgetfulness. She was a little shocked by his vindictive tone. Even if he had been let down, he was not an Afghan, and such a naturally kind man must surely take a more charitable view of feminine frailty. She said tentatively, "But you can't believe an incompatible couple should remain bound together in mutual unhappiness." His eyes came back to her as if her voice had recalled him from a long distance. "Were we discussing incompatible couples?" he asked mildly. "I thought it was the Afghan attitude toward infidelity. Only a few years ago they stoned unfaithful wives in the biblical manner." "Ugh!" she shivered. "How inhuman!" "You can't condone that," Clive grinned. Perhaps that was going a little too far, but no doubt it was an effective deterrent. Psychological disturbances didn't get any sympathy in the seraglio, and I don't know that our new freedoms have made women, or men either, any happier. The sombre look returned to his face, and he sprang to his feet, scattering the cushions as he took a quick pace across the room, saying savagely, "The more I see of women, the more convinced I am that the right way to treat them is to keep them shut up in a harem." Angela stared at him in astonishment. Voice and demeanour were so at variance with his usual pleasant manner. His beard actually seemed to bristle with suppressed anger, and he clenched and unclenched his hands. Someone at some time must have wounded him very deeply, and she felt a surge of indignation against that unknown woman, whose mere memory could so shake his normal tolerance. She said uncertainly, "That sounds a bit drastic. What have we poor women done to merit such animosity?" He turned and stared at her, as if surprised to find her still there. "Present company accepted, of course," he told her awkwardly. He passed his hand over his brow and smiled apologetically. "I suppose it was that," he pointed to the shuddery, "that touched me off. That and, other things. Forget it." He looked at her consideringly. "You're still only a child in experience." "That we don't know," she reminded him. "It's obvious," he insisted. "I haven't lived with you all these weeks without learning that. You haven't yet acquired the damnable wiles of a sophisticated woman." A little nettled, for he was suggesting that she was naive, she cried with spirit, "And do you know so much about sophisticated women? I thought you were only familiar with primitive peoples." "I've lived in cities," he informed her dryly. "The only difference being that among primitive people I've seen the material in the raw. The basic instincts are the same." With indescribable bitterness in his voice, he added, When Miss Afghanistan realizes her potentialities, her menfolk will regret letting her out of purdah." "Well, you've got me in a sort of purdah here," Angela remarked, "since even Abdullah daren't look at me." He laughed, and lightly flipped her cheek with his fingertip. "True woman, aren't you?" She didn't think he meant it as a compliment. "But at least I've kept you out of harm's way for whoever is waiting for you." Angela picked up the chadri in silence. Was someone waiting for her? Fervently she hoped not. She smoothed the long folds over her arm. Her innocent desire to try the garment on seemed to have provoked Clive's tirade against her sex, which was far from her intent. He looked at her bent dark head with a curious expression. She seemed very young, very vulnerable, and quite incapable of the wiles against which he had been inveiling. "You'd better return that thing to Adiza as tactfully as possible," he said laconically. Suddenly he seemed to relax, and a twinkle came into his eye. "Unless you want to wear it on our trek and walk respectfully one pace behind me." "Certainly not." She moved to the door and said over her shoulder, "That wouldn't be suitable since I'm not your wife." His face darkened. "No, you're not that," he said emphatically. Angela went through into her own room, reflecting that she had asked for it, and there was no doubt from Clive's look and tone that he was thankful there was no emotional attachment between them. The knowledge was a little wounding, for she was not without feminine conceit, but she comforted her ego by deciding he would be a very uncomfortable sort of husband if he expected complete submission from his wife. Perhaps that was what had broken up his romance, for she was certain now that there had been one. Clive Stratton was too despotic to appreciate the modern girl's independent outlook, yet he must have cared deeply if her memory kept him roaming over the waste places of the globe. Angela felt a burning curiosity about that woman who had left such a cruel scar, but knew she could not possibly question Clive to satisfy it. In fact, her own association with him was nearing its end, and that thought produced a deep depression. Though Clive was capable of accomplishing the arduous journey on foot, he was unwilling to allow Angela to essay it. They would find buses, he told her, once they had climbed out of the valley and crossed the pass, but their routes were many miles away. She must ride. He went from village to village in search of mules, and eventually procured a pair of scrawny animals, which he brought home in triumph. One would carry Angela, the other his gear. This transaction caused her some perturbation. As far as she knew, she possessed nothing, and she was being an ever-increasing expense to her benefactor. Even when they reached civilization, she would still be dependent upon his bounty. When she hesitantly hinted at her poverty, he pooh-poohed her scruples. I had to get one mule anyway. I couldn't lug the typewriter all the way, and I got the two cheap, and I must owe you quite a lot for all that typing you've done for me. Far more than the few Afghanis I've given Aziza for clothes, he told her. You can continue to be my secretary in Kabul until a more satisfactory arrangement can be made for you. He surveyed her thoughtfully. I'm sure once we're there we'll be able to trace your relatives through the air company's records. At least they must have a list of the missing passengers, and one of the names will surely ring a bell. She clasped her hands nervously, dreading that moment of revelation. The past months had been a period of suspension between her past and her future, and she shrank from what those records might tell her. Clive saw the tension in her face, and laid a comforting hand over hers. Come now, you can't want to exist forever in limbo. She could not voice the fear that was uppermost in her mind. Suppose she had discovered that she belonged to another man. Clive had become her whole world, friend, doctor, and protector. By nature something of a leaner, he was her bulwark against life's problems. She could not contemplate an existence without him to support her. But he naturally would be wanting to be rid of her. She must have been an imposition in spite of his denials. She consoled herself with that vague suggestion that she might continue as his secretary. It was her anchor in a sea of uncertainties. It was a bright, cloudless day when they set off. Clive told Angela it was It was a bright, cloudless day when they set off. Clive told Angela it was only a respite before rainy weather would set in, the rain that was necessary to make the crops grow. The path, if path it could be called, snaked up a boulder-strewn route out of the valley. Looking back, Angela saw the wooden houses of the village clinging to the cliff ledge upon which they were built like a group of swallows' nests, and reflected that she had in fact been happy during her sojourn there. A happiness that was largely due to Clive's company. He walked ahead of her, leading the other mule, whistling gaily. He had no regrets, though neither of them would see that village again. The pass was a narrow passage between towering cliffs, where, since the sun never penetrated its shadows, snow still lingered. Beyond it, the barely discernible track crept along the edge of fearsome abysses and under beetling overhangs of bare rock. Occasionally it widened into stone-strewn plateaus, where a scant herbage struggled for existence. The melting snow cascaded down the mountainsides in waterfalls that often crossed their route and their route through which they had to pass. The sure-footed mules seemed unperturbed by the difficulties of the road, and Angela's thick sheepskin coat and boots kept out most of the wet. They halted at midday for food, and rest on a broad ledge above a shadow-filled ravine. The mountains all around them were bare and stark, not at all alpine in character, the lower ones looking more like giant gnarled mounds of earth instead of peaks. Clive hobbled the mules and left them to crop eagerly at the coarse grass. He had filled a thermos with welcome coffee before leaving, and produced kebabs, grilled on the brazier in their hut, and a flap of the usual barley bread. We should make a village where I'm known before nightfall, he told her, and the road tomorrow will be much less grueling. That's something, she laughed a little shakily, for she had found their awesome surroundings intimidating. But will your villagers welcome me? Of course, you're my woman, he gave her a mischievous glance. And whatever other failings they have, Afghans never lack in hospitality. Afghans never lack in hospitality. A guest is sacred, and a poor man will share his last tea leaf with one. They reached the village in the late afternoon. It was encircled by high mud walls and looked like a miniature fortress, but there was no doubt about their welcome. A flock of brown-skinned, black-haired children raced into the adobe huts to give notice of their arrival, and the head man came out himself to greet them, embracing Clive like a long-lost brother. They had descended several thousand feet, and the air was almost balmy. Fruit trees were coming into blossom outside the village walls, and there was fresh grass for the mules. On a fire in the middle of the compound, a lamb was put to roast in their honour. Angela stood a little apart while Clive unpacked their gear. Instinctively, she had drawn her scarf across the lower part of her face. More from shyness than from modesty, aware of the curious glances thrown in her direction. Giving their luggage to the willing porterage of the older children, Clive came across to her. "I'm afraid we can't expect a hut to ourselves," he told her, "and I've been invited to join the men for a feast. You'll be accommodated in the women's quarters in the headman's house. They'll look after you, so you needn't be afraid." "Can't I stay with you?" she asked anxiously, dreading to be separated from him. "Impossible. Dinner is strictly for men only." "You'll be all right, Angela. No need to panic." So perforce she had to leave him and enter the women's quarters. Excuse me. The headman's family consisted of wives, mothers, grandmothers, and daughters of all ages. Impossible to sort them out. They welcomed her with smiles and obvious curiosity, bringing her water to wash her hands and face, but they could only converse by signs. Bone-weary as she was, they seemed to Angela like fantastic figures in a dream. They gave her green tea to drink and fresh mutton with rice to eat. All, she noticed, wore quantities of jewellery, even the little girls. It represented their savings. Finally, she was shown a mat in a corner covered with several skins and thick quilts, and so weary was she that she fell asleep immediately, in spite of the noise from the compound, where the men were evidently enjoying themselves. On the evening of the next day, they reached a much larger village and one that possessed a caravanserai, or tea-house. This one, Clive told her, was on a bus route, and they would have transport for the rest of their journey. As they neared it, Clive pulled a silk shawl from his baggage and handed it to her. "Keep that over your face," he commanded her. "You'll find it less stifling than the woolen scarf you wore last night." "But must I wear one at all? I thought you said the veil was obsolete." "In Kabul, but emancipation mayn't have reached as far as this." He glanced at her legs. She wore a tunic and a pair of men's breeches above her boots. "Have you got a skirt among your things?" "Look," she began forcefully. "This gear was your idea, though it shocked Aziza, since I wasn't going to ride, but I won't be bundled up into any more clothes to suit your belated sense of propriety. I'm hot enough as it is." "All right, you can change at the inn, but keep your face covered." Obediently, she wrapped the silk around her head and face, leaving only her eyes exposed. Thus she rode up to the tea-house. The space in front of it was full of men, bold, wild-looking hillmen with knives stuck in their belts and dark eyes flashing under their turbans. They carried themselves with the arrogant pride that is characteristic of their race, and Angela guessed that they were Pashtuns, or Pathans, as they are sometimes called. She saw them throw furtive glances in her direction, and Clive assumed a fierce scowl, as befitted a jealous husband when other men glanced at his wife. She had to stifle a desire to giggle. It was so absurd, but she realized it was assumed for her protection. The Sarai was a long, low building and looked dirty and neglected, but evidently was familiar ground to Clive, for he called loudly, "Shere Shah!" A pink-turbaned individual with the countenance of a brigand in a melodrama came hurrying out of the building. Seeing Clive, he bowed ceremoniously and began a flow of compliments and inquiries. Clive cut him short with a demand for a room for the Khanum Sahib. The man shot a startled look at Angela, and his manner changed completely. He stood with bowed head and folded hands while Clive helped Angela to dismount. Throwing the reins of the two animals to a lively-looking Hazara lad who appeared to be a member of the staff, Clive took Angela's arm and piloted her in the wake of the innkeeper. They went through a room of which the walls were painted with red frescoes of rifles and daggers, in the centre of which an iron stove was roaring, excluding an aroma of resinous pinewood. Angela halted, liking the warmth and colour of it, but Clive repelled her forward, for there were men seated on benches all around the walls. The upper room, it was only a loft, that she finally entered after climbing a ladder-like stair, was a small rectangular box with a square of window high up on the wall containing a string bedstead. "Hardly the Ritz," Clive commented, surveying it, "but it's the best they can offer, and at least it's private." "The room downstairs was much pleasanter." "You can't expect them to evacuate it for a mere woman," he said mockingly. "Tea-houses are still a masculine preserve. However, I dare say we can improve this one." An Hazara boy brought a brazier and an oil lamp, keeping his eyes discreetly downcast in front of Angela. Some cushions were produced, which Angela eyed dubiously before seating herself upon them. They did not look very clean. Clive went to fetch their supper, and returned with eggs fried in mutton fat, which was all the place could provide, and of course a pot of tea. He unearthed spoons from their baggage. The natives ate with their fingers. They sat side by side on the bed to eat their meal. Uneasily listening to the shouts and singing from below, and what sounded like a quarrel, Angela inquired anxiously, "I suppose this is where I'm to sleep, if I can, but where will you be, Clive?" "With my wife, of course," he returned with a sly glance at her. "That will be expected of me." "Do you have to tell them all I'm your wife?" "What else? They wouldn't understand our, peculiar relationship." She glanced round the small room which she seemed to fill and felt herself blush. "There isn't much space," she faltered. "Nor any toilet facilities," he pointed out. "You'll have to go to bed unwashed. As for other things, there's the great out-of-doors." "With all those men about?" "I will keep guard." The intimacy of their situation caused her to blush anew, yet she had spent 2 whole days with him in easy camaraderie, and weeks of solitude in the village, and it was the single small room and the bed that had suddenly made their association significant. It's only like camping out," she said bravely. "Of course." He did not seem in the least embarrassed, but then he never had regarded her as a woman, only as a patient, or a child, and certainly not a wife. The boy brought in their baggage, and Clive insisted that she unpacked a skirt for the morrow's wear. She had brought with her some of the crude garments that she had made over from Aziz's. "I shall look a sketch," she sighed. "A tacky old skirt and that shawl over my head." "To travel on the bus you must look like a modest Moslem wife, since you've no European clothes," he pointed out. "Then I'll match you, for you look anything but civilized," she retorted, glancing at his length of hair and beard and Hillman's dress. "That's the whole idea," he returned gravely. She slept indifferently on the string bed, but Clive lay outside her door, wrapped in a blanket.